March 8, 1943, Mid-Atlantic, 47-12 north, 28-36 west. The ocean is a void. Not the romantic, infinite void of explorers' tales, but something colder. A liquid grave stretching in every direction, swallowing light, swallowing hope, swallowing men. The water is black-green, heaving in slow, patient swells that have no beginning and no end. Above, the sky is a lid of iron-gray clouds sealed tight, pressing down. No sun, no stars, just the howl of wind across the surface. And beneath it, in the crushing darkness below, the steady electric hum of a German U-boat's motors, U-221. Type GEC. Displacement, 769 tons surfaced, 871 submerged. Crew 44 men. Commander, Kapitänleutnant Hans Treuer, 29 years old, veteran of 14 patrols, holder of the Iron Cross First Class. His boat has been at sea for 31 days, hunting Allied convoys along the Great Circle Route between Halifax and Liverpool. In that time, they have sunk 3 merchantmen, 11,400 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. Respectable numbers. Good numbers. The kind of numbers that earn commendations, shore leave, perhaps a knight's cross if the luck holds. But the luck is not holding. For the past 6 hours, U-221 has been stalked. Treuer knows this in the way a hunted animal knows. Not through evidence, not through logic, but through instinct, through the prickling awareness that something is wrong. The destroyer appeared on the horizon at dawn, a gray silhouette against a grayer sky too far away to pose an immediate threat. Standard procedure: submerge, go silent, wait for the enemy to pass. The convoy routes are vast, the ocean vaster still. If you stay quiet, stay deep, stay patient, the destroyers move on. They always move on, except this one did not. It turned. Not randomly, not speculatively, but with purpose, with certainty. It turned directly toward U-221, as though it could see through 200 feet of seawater, through the darkness and pressure and silence, directly to the steel hull hiding below. And now it is there, almost directly overhead. Its propellers a distant thunder, its sonar, if it has sonar, and Treuer suspects it does, pinging into the depths like a blind man tapping a cane. Treuer stands in the control room, one hand braced against the periscope housing, listening. Everyone is listening. The crew is frozen in their stations, hardly breathing, eyes fixed on nothing, waiting for the sound that will end their lives. A depth charge detonating close enough to breach the hull, the shriek of metal tearing, the flood of icy water, the lungs filling, the darkness closing in. But the sound does not come. Instead, there is only the pinging. That damned pinging. A sharp metallic pulse over and over echoing through the water, through the hull, through the bones of every man aboard. It is not loud, not yet, but it is relentless. And with each pulse, the destroyer adjusts its course. Inches closer. Tightens the noose. Treuer knows what this is. He has heard the reports, read the intelligence summaries, listened to the rumors filtering back from other boats. The Allies have developed something new. A way to see in the dark. A way to hear what should not be heard. The admirals call it nonsense, wishful thinking. Allied propaganda designed to demoralize U-boat crews. But Treuer is not an admiral. He is a submariner. And he knows, in the way that men who live in thin steel cylinders at the bottom of the ocean know, that the game has changed. The destroyer is no longer guessing. It is tracking. And U-221 is no longer invisible. This is the story of how that happened. How in the span of less than 2 years the German U-boat force went from predator to prey. How a device so simple, so unassuming that its inventors doubted it would work, became the weapon that broke the back of the Third Reich's most feared arm. How the silent hunters of the Atlantic learned too late that silence was no longer enough, and how the men who built that device, scientists and engineers who never fired a shot, never saw the enemy, never stepped aboard a warship, won one of the most decisive battles of the Second World War without ever leaving the laboratory. This is the story of Sonar. And the men who made submarines blind. To understand what happened in March 1943, you must go back to September 1939, to the first day of the war, when the rules of naval combat were still those of the First World War, and the Atlantic Ocean was still a place where ships could disappear without a trace. On September 3, 1939, 11 hours after Britain declared war on Germany, the German submarine U-30, operating southwest of Ireland, torpedoed the British passenger liner SS Athenia, 117 people died, including 28 Americans. It was, according to German naval law, a mistake. Passenger ships were supposed to be exempt from unrestricted submarine warfare, but it was also a preview, a glimpse of what the next 6 years would look like. By the end of 1939, the U-boats had sunk 114 Allied ships. By the end of 1940, the number was 471. By the end of 1941, it was 432. And in 1942, the worst year of the Battle of the Atlantic, 160 Allied ships were torpedoed and sunk, totaling over 6 million tons of shipping. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, hospital ships. If it floated and flew an Allied flag, it was a target. The mathematics were brutal. Britain imported 68 million tons of goods per year before the war: food, fuel, raw materials, everything needed to sustain an industrialized nation. By 1942, that figure had dropped to 23 million tons. The British population was on rationed calories, subsisting on bread and potatoes and powdered eggs. The Royal Navy was running out of fuel. The RAF was running out of aviation gasoline. If the trend continued, Britain would starve. If Britain starved, the war was over, and the U-boats were winning because they were invisible. Not literally, of course. A surfaced U-boat could be spotted by an aircraft engaged by a destroyer, sunk by gunfire, but submarines spent most of their time submerged, and beneath the surface they were ghosts. The human eye cannot see through water. Radar in 1939 could not penetrate the ocean's surface. Radio waves dissipate in seawater within feet. The only way to find a submerged submarine was to stumble across it by accident, or to use hydrophones, underwater microphones that could detect the sound of a submarine's engines or propellers. Hydrophones were not new. They had been used in the First World War with limited success. The problem was that the ocean is loud. Waves breaking, marine life clicking and groaning, the creak of a ship's own hull. Isolating the sound of a submarine from the ambient noise was nearly impossible, and even if you did detect it, you had no way to measure the range or bearing with any accuracy. Hydrophones could tell you that a submarine was out there somewhere but not where, and if you could not pinpoint the submarine's location, you could not attack it. So the convoys sailed in formations, protected by destroyers and corvettes that zigzagged around the perimeter, dropping depth charges at shadows and guesses. Sometimes they got lucky. Most of the time they did not. The U-boats slipped through, fired their torpedoes, and vanished back into the depths. And the convoys burned. The Allies needed a way to see in the dark. They needed a way to turn the ocean transparent. They needed sonar. The word sonar is an acronym: sound navigation and ranging. It is the underwater equivalent of radar, a system that sends out a pulse of sound, waits for that sound to bounce off an object, and measures the time it takes for the echo to return. From that measurement, you can calculate distance. From the direction of the echo, you can determine bearing, and if you send out enough pulses, track enough echoes, you can build a picture of what is out there in the darkness. You can see. The principle was understood as early as 1906, when a British engineer named Lewis Nixon proposed using sound waves to detect icebergs in the wake of the Titanic disaster. But turning the principle into a working device was another matter entirely. Sound behaves strangely in water. It bends, refracts, scatters. Temperature layers in the ocean create zones where sound waves curve away from the surface, creating shadow zones where a submarine can hide. Salinity affects sound speed. Pressure affects sound speed. The ocean is not a uniform medium, it is a chaotic, shifting labyrinth of acoustic anomalies. During the First World War, the British and French experimented with active sound detection systems, devices that emitted a pulse of sound and listened for the echo. The British called theirs ASDIC, an acronym for the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. The French called theirs Hydrophone Directeur. Both were primitive, unreliable, and limited in range. But they worked, barely. By 1918, ASDIC-equipped destroyers were credited with sinking several German U-boats, though the numbers were never confirmed and the technology remained classified. After the war, ASDIC development continued in secret. The British Admiralty, convinced that the submarine threat could be neutralized through technology, poured resources into refining the system. By 1935, they had produced a working model with a range of approximately 1,500 yards, enough to detect a submerged submarine before it could fire a torpedo. Trials were promising. Confidence was high. When war broke out in 1939, the Royal Navy had equipped most of its destroyers and corvettes with ASDIC sets, and the official line was that the submarine menace had been solved. It had not been solved. The problem with early ASDIC was not that it did not work. It did work under ideal conditions. The problem was that ideal conditions were rare. The ocean was too complex, the technology too crude, the operators too inexperienced. An ASDIC set could detect a submarine, yes, but only if the submarine was within range, at the right depth, in the right temperature layer, and not moving too fast or too slow. And even then, the echo was faint, fuzzy, easily confused with rocks, wrecks, schools of fish, or thermal layers. Worse, ASDIC was directional. It sent out a narrow beam of sound like a flashlight in a dark room. If the submarine was outside that beam, you would not detect it. To search an area, the operator had to manually rotate the ASDIC transducer in a slow, sweeping arc, pinging continuously, listening for an echo. It was painstaking, exhausting work, and a skilled U-boat commander could evade it by moving slowly, hugging the bottom, or exploiting thermal layers that bent the sound waves away. And then there was the lost contact problem. ASDIC could track a submarine as long as the submarine was within range and the destroyer stayed on course. But the moment the destroyer closed to attack, racing in to drop depth charges, the ASDIC lost contact. The destroyer's own noise drowned out the echo. The submarine, alerted by the sound of the destroyer's engines, would turn, dive, change speed, and by the time the depth charges detonated and the water settled, the submarine was gone. The destroyer would have to start the search all over again, pinging blindly, hoping to reacquire the target. In 1940 and 1941, ASDIC-equipped destroyers sank an average of 1 U-boat for every 250 hours of active searching. The odds were abysmal. The U-boat force, meanwhile, was growing. In 1939, Germany had 57 operational U-boats. By 1942, it had over 300. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, was deploying them in wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines that would converge on a convoy, attack from multiple directions, overwhelm the escorts, and slip away before reinforcements arrived. The convoys were being slaughtered. The Allies needed something better. They needed a way to track submarines continuously, even during an attack. They needed a way to see through the noise and chaos and darkness. They needed a system that was faster, more accurate, more reliable than anything that had come before. They needed what would later be called the Hedgehog. But before the Hedgehog, there was the Lee Light. Before the Lee Light, there was centimetric radar. And before centimetric radar, there was the magnetron, a device so revolutionary, so far ahead of its time, that when British scientists first demonstrated it to their American counterparts in 1940, the Americans thought it was a hoax. The story of sonar is also the story of radar, because the two technologies developed in parallel, often in the same laboratories by the same people. And in 1940, the most important laboratory in the Allied war effort was not in London or Washington, but in a nondescript building on the campus of the University of Birmingham, where a mild-mannered physicist named John Randall was working on a problem that had stumped researchers for a decade. Radar, radio, detection and ranging was already in use by 1940. The British had developed a network of coastal radar stations called Chain Home, which could detect incoming German bombers from over 100 miles away. The technology had been crucial during the Battle of Britain, giving RAF fighters enough warning to intercept the Luftwaffe before it reached its targets. But Chain Home radar operated on long wavelengths, 10 to 13 meters, which made it excellent for detecting large objects like aircraft at long range, but useless for detecting small objects like submarines or surfaced U-boats. What the Allies needed was radar that operated on much shorter wavelengths, 10 centimeters or less. Shorter wavelengths meant tighter beams, better resolution, the ability to distinguish a submarine's conning tower from the surrounding waves. But generating high-power radio waves at such short wavelengths required a device that did not yet exist. In February 1940, Randall and his colleague Harry Boot invented it. They called it the cavity magnetron, a vacuum tube that used magnetic fields to accelerate electrons in a circular path, generating microwave radiation at unprecedented power levels. The first prototype, cobbled together in a matter of weeks, produced 400 watts of power at a wavelength of 9.8 centimeters. Within months, they had refined the design to produce kilowatts. It was a quantum leap, a piece of technology that should not have been possible for another 20 years. The British government, recognizing the magnetron's potential, decided to share it with the United States. In September 1940, a British delegation traveled to Washington carrying the cavity magnetron in a locked briefcase. When they demonstrated it to American scientists at Bell Labs, the Americans were stunned. One engineer later recalled, "It was as if a group of barbarians had suddenly shown us how to make fire." The magnetron became the foundation of modern radar. Within a year, American and British engineers had developed compact, lightweight radar sets that could be mounted on aircraft, ships, and even submarines. These sets could detect a surfaced U-boat from miles away, even at night, even in heavy weather. And in early 1943, they began installing them on Allied patrol aircraft flying over the Atlantic. For the U-boats, it was a disaster. U-boat tactics in 1940 and 1941 relied on surfacing at night to recharge batteries and move at high speed, far faster than they could travel submerged. At night, on the surface, a U-boat was nearly invisible. Its low profile made it almost impossible to spot from a ship, and existing radar could not detect it. But the new centimetric radar changed everything. Patrol aircraft equipped with the technology could sweep vast areas of ocean, detect surfaced U-boats from 10 miles away, and attack before the submarine could dive. The results were immediate and devastating. In March 1943 alone, 15 U-boats were sunk by aircraft. In April, 15 more. In May 41, Dönitz, watching his crews die in ever-increasing numbers, realized that the Allies had achieved something he had thought impossible. They had made the night transparent. The U-boats could no longer surface safely. They were forced to remain submerged for longer periods, moving more slowly, conserving battery power, unable to keep pace with the convoys. But radar was only half the equation. Radar could find a surfaced submarine. It could not find a submerged one. For that, the Allies needed sonar. And in 1943, they finally got it right. The breakthrough came not from a single invention, but from a series of incremental improvements, each one building on the last, each one making the system a little better, a little faster, a little more reliable, better transducers that could send out stronger pulses, better receivers that could detect fainter echoes, better signal processing that could filter out noise and isolate the submarine's signature, better training for the operators, teaching them to recognize the difference between a submarine, a whale, and a thermal layer. But the most important innovation was tactical, not technological. In 1942, a British naval officer named Frederick Walker was given command of an escort group assigned to protect convoys in the western approaches. Walker was not a scientist or an engineer. He was a sailor, a tactician, a man who had spent decades at sea and understood instinctively how to fight a battle in 3 dimensions. And he realized something that had eluded most of his contemporaries. The problem with ASDIC was not the technology. It was how it was being used. Standard doctrine in 1942 called for a single destroyer to hunt a submarine alone, pinging with ASDIC, racing into attack when contact was made, then losing contact during the attack and starting the search over again. It was inefficient, exhausting, and rarely successful. Walker proposed a different approach: use multiple ships working in coordination. One ship would maintain ASDIC contact, tracking the submarine continuously. The other ships would maneuver into attack positions, guided by the first ship's reports, and drop depth charges in a pattern designed to bracket the submarine's probable location. It was called creeping attack, and it worked. Walker's escort group, using this tactic, sank 6 U-boats in 1942 and 1943. Other escort groups adopted the technique, refining it, perfecting it. By mid-1943, the U-boats were no longer slipping away. They were being hunted methodically, relentlessly, by destroyers that could track them through every twist and turn, every dive and evasion, until the depth charges found their mark. And then there was the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was not sonar. It was a weapon. But it was a weapon designed specifically to complement sonar, to solve the lost contact problem that had plagued ASDIC since its inception. Traditional depth charges were dropped off the stern of a ship as it passed over the submarine's estimated position. The charges would sink to a preset depth, then detonate, creating a massive shockwave designed to rupture the submarine's hull. The problem was that the ship had to pass directly over the submarine to drop the charges, and in doing so, it would lose ASDIC contact. By the time the charges exploded, the submarine could have moved, and the ship would have to reacquire contact and start the attack all over again. The Hedgehog changed that. Instead of dropping charges off the stern, the Hedgehog fired them forward, ahead of the ship, in a pattern of 24 small projectiles. Each projectile contained 35 pounds of explosive and was designed to detonate on contact with the submarine's hull. Because the Hedgehog fired forward, the ship could maintain ASDIC contact throughout the attack, adjusting its aim in real time. And because the projectiles only exploded on contact, there was no doubt. If you heard an explosion, you had hit the target. The Hedgehog was introduced in 1943, and the results were dramatic. Ships equipped with Hedgehogs had a kill rate 5 times higher than ships using traditional depth charges. U-boats, already reeling from the introduction of centimetric radar, now faced an enemy that could track them continuously and strike with pinpoint accuracy. The silent hunters were being hunted, and they were losing. Captain Lieutenant Hans Treuer did not know any of this on March 8, 1943. He did not know about the cavity magnetron, or the Hedgehog, or Commander Walker's creeping attack. He knew only that the destroyer overhead was tracking him with a precision that should not have been possible, and that his options were running out. He ordered the boat deeper. 300 feet. 350. The hull groaned under the pressure, rivets popping, seams weeping seawater. The pinging followed them down. The destroyer followed them down. Treuer ordered a turn to starboard, then a turn to port, zigzagging through the depths trying to break contact. The pinging did not stop, and then the depth charges began. Not the scattered random pattern of earlier years, but something different. Something deliberate. The charges detonated in a line, one after another, each explosion closer than the last, walking toward the submarine like footsteps. The boat shook. Light bulbs shattered. Men clung to their stations, praying. Treuer knew with absolute certainty that the next pattern would find them. He surfaced. It was not a decision so much as an instinct, a gambler's last throw. Surfaced, the boat could use its diesels, could outrun the destroyer, could at least die fighting instead of drowning in the dark. The boat clawed its way upward, breaking the surface in a fountain of spray, the conning tower hatch flying open, seawater pouring in, Treuer scrambling up the ladder, gasping for air. The destroyer was 300 yards away. Closing fast, Treuer ordered the crew to abandon ship. They spilled out of the hatches, jumping into the icy Atlantic, swimming away from the boat as fast as they could. Treuer was the last to leave. He set the scuttling charges, climbed down the side of the hull, and let the ocean take him. U-221 sank in less than 2 minutes. The destroyer's crew picked up 37 survivors, including Treuer. 7 men were lost. Treuer spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. In interviews conducted after the war, he said that the most terrifying part of the encounter was not the depth charges, or the surfacing, or the knowledge that he was about to die. It was the realization that the destroyer had known exactly where they were, that it had tracked them continuously, unerringly through every maneuver. That invisibility, the one advantage submarines had always relied on, was gone. He said it felt like being watched by God. By May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a turning point. In that month alone, 41 U-boats were sunk, more than in any previous month of the war. Dönitz, watching his fleet disintegrate, withdrew the surviving boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The hunting grounds that had been so profitable in 1940 and 1941 were now death traps. The U-boats retreated to the South Atlantic, to the Indian Ocean, to anywhere the Allies' new technologies had not yet reached. But it was only a matter of time. The statistics tell the story. In 1942, U-boats sank 1,060 Allied ships. In 1943, they sank 597. In 1944, they sank 205. In 1945, before the war ended, they sank 56. The curve was unmistakable. The U-boat force, once the terror of the Atlantic, had been broken. Not by a single weapon or a single battle, but by the cumulative weight of technologies: radar, sonar, the Hedgehog, the Lee Light, long-range patrol aircraft, that made it impossible for submarines to operate with impunity. Over the course of the war, 784 U-boats were commissioned into the Kriegsmarine. Of those, 648 were lost in combat. 30,000 German submariners served in U-boats during the war. 30,000 men, and of those 28,000 died, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any branch of any military in the Second World War. They were brave men, skilled men, men who believed they were fighting for their country, for their families, for something greater than themselves, and they were killed methodically and efficiently by an enemy they could not see, could not fight, could not escape. An enemy that turned the ocean against them, that made the darkness their prison, that hunted them not with rage or hatred, but with mathematics and physics and the cold logic of engineering. They died because someone invented a better way to see in the dark. There is a photograph, rarely reproduced, taken aboard a British destroyer in April 1943. It shows the ASDIC operator's station, a cramped compartment lit by a single red bulb, dominated by a large circular display covered in a glass dome. On the display, a faint green trace spirals outward from the center, marking the echo of a submarine detected 2 miles away. The operator, a young man whose name is not recorded, leans over the display, one hand on the range dial, the other on the bearing control, his face illuminated by the eerie green glow. He does not look triumphant. He does not look afraid. He looks focused, intent, like a watchmaker adjusting the gears of a clock. This is his job. This is what he was trained to do. Somewhere 2 miles away, 40 men are about to die, and he is the one who will guide the depth charges to their target. He knows this, and he will do it anyway because the alternative, letting the submarine escape, letting it sink another convoy, letting more men die, is unthinkable. There is no glory in this photograph, no heroism, just a man, a machine, and the knowledge that war is not fought by soldiers alone. It is fought by scientists and engineers, by factory workers and radar operators, by people who will never fire a shot, but whose work determines who lives and who dies. The men who invented sonar, who refined it, who built it into the weapons that broke the U-boat force, were not warriors. They were mathematicians, physicists, acousticians, people who spent their days in laboratories and their nights scribbling equations, people who measured their success not in medals or commendations but in incremental improvements, in tenths of a decibel, in fractions of a second, and yet they won the war, not alone, of course. The sailors and pilots and soldiers won it too, in the mud and blood and chaos of the battlefield. But without the scientists, without the engineers, without the unglamorous, painstaking work of building better tools, better weapons, better ways to see and hear and strike, those soldiers would have lost. Technology does not win wars by itself, but it determines the terms on which wars are fought. And in the Battle of the Atlantic, the Allies rewrote those terms. They turned the ocean transparent. They made submarines visible, and in doing so, they ensured that the convoys, the lifeblood of Britain, the arteries that carried food and fuel and hope, could reach their destination. That the war could be won. The legacy of sonar extends far beyond the Second World War. The principles developed in those desperate years, active acoustic detection, signal processing, multi-ship coordination, became the foundation of modern anti-submarine warfare. The technologies refined in the laboratories of Birmingham and MIT evolved into the sophisticated sonar systems used by navies today, systems that can detect submarines from hundreds of miles away, that can map the ocean floor in exquisite detail, that can listen to the songs of whales and the breaking of ice shelves and the rumble of underwater volcanoes. Sonar is used by fishermen to locate schools of fish, by oceanographers to study currents and temperature layers, by archaeologists to find shipwrecks, by geologists to map tectonic plates. It is one of the most versatile, most powerful tools humanity has ever developed for exploring and understanding the underwater world. But it began as a weapon, a tool for killing submarines, for hunting men in the dark. And there is something profoundly ironic about that, because sonar at its core is a tool for seeing, for making the invisible visible, for bringing light into darkness. And yet it was born of war, of the need to destroy, to dominate, to ensure that one side lived and the other died. It is a testament to the strange duality of human ingenuity, that the same impulse that drives us to explore and understand also drives us to conquer and kill. That the same technologies that can reveal the wonders of the deep ocean can also end lives with surgical precision. The men who built sonar did not set out to change the world. They set out to solve a problem. A practical, immediate problem. How do you find a submarine? And in solving that problem, they unleashed forces they could not have predicted. They created tools that would be used for decades, for centuries, in ways they never imagined. They changed the nature of naval warfare, the balance of power between nations, the very fabric of global conflict. And they did it with sound, with physics, with the patient, incremental work of science. There is a phrase that appears in the memoirs of several U-boat commanders who survived the war. We became the hunted. It appears again and again, in slightly different forms, but always carrying the same weight, the same sense of reversal. The men who had once prowled the Atlantic with impunity, who had sunk hundreds of ships, who had believed themselves to be the apex predators of the ocean, suddenly found themselves on the defensive, running, hiding, dying. One commander, Werner Henke, who survived the sinking of U-515 in April 1944, described it this way: "We knew the game was over when we realized they could hear us breathe. Every sound we made, every turn of the propeller, every creak of the hull, it gave us away. We were no longer hunters. We were prey." Another, Eric Topp, one of the most successful U-boat aces of the war, wrote in his diary, "The ocean is no longer our ally. It has become our enemy. The darkness we once relied on now conceals our pursuers. The silence we once trusted now betrays us. We are fighting a war we cannot win, against an enemy we cannot see." These are not the words of cowards. They are the words of men who understood with brutal clarity that the rules had changed, that the technologies they had relied on, stealth, surprise, the vastness of the ocean, were no longer enough, that the Allies had developed something better, something faster, something more precise, and that no amount of courage or skill or determination could overcome that advantage. This is the lesson of the Battle of the Atlantic. Not that technology wins wars, but that technology determines the conditions under which wars are fought. The German U-boat force was not defeated because it lacked bravery or competence. It was defeated because the Allies built better tools. Because British and American scientists, working in laboratories far from the front lines, developed the means to turn the ocean transparent, to see in the dark, to hunt the hunters, and the device that made this possible, the humble, unassuming sonar transducer, bolted to the hull of a destroyer, sending out pulses of sound into the void, became one of the most decisive weapons of the war. Not because it killed more men than bombs or bullets, but because it rendered the enemy's primary advantage obsolete. It removed the cloak of invisibility. It made the submarines blind. In the decades after the war, sonar technology continued to evolve. The Cold War brought a new submarine arms race, with the United States and Soviet Union developing nuclear-powered submarines capable of staying submerged for months, carrying ballistic missiles that could destroy cities from beneath the waves. And with those submarines came new sonar systems, passive sonars that could listen without transmitting, detecting the faint sounds of a submarine's machinery from hundreds of miles away. Towed arrays, kilometers-long cables studded with hydrophones, dragged behind ships or submarines, creating acoustic surveillance networks that spanned entire oceans. The principles remained the same. Send out a sound or listen for one. Measure the echo or the noise. Calculate the distance, the bearing, the speed. Build a picture of what is out there in the darkness beyond the reach of light. But the scale had changed. The technology had become so sophisticated, so powerful, that the oceans, once the last great wilderness, the final frontier of human ignorance, had been mapped, measured, catalogued. There were no more hiding places, no more sanctuaries. The submarines of the Cold War operated in an environment where every sound they made, every vibration, every thermal signature could be detected, analyzed, tracked. The ocean had become a battle space, as transparent and measurable as a chessboard. And yet, even in this age of total acoustic surveillance, the cat-and-mouse game continues. Submarines are built quieter, coated in sound-absorbing materials designed to slip through the acoustic nets. Sonar operators refine their techniques, learning to distinguish between the sound of a submarine and the sound of a whale, between a genuine contact and a false alarm. The technology improves. The tactics adapt. The struggle between hunter and hunted, between invisibility and detection goes on. But the outcome is no longer in doubt. The age of the silent hunter is over. The submarines, once the terrors of the deep, are no longer invisible. They can be found. They can be tracked. They can be destroyed. Sonar made sure of that. Today, if you visit the Imperial War Museum in London, you can see one of the original ASDIC sets used during the Battle of the Atlantic. It is a large, ungainly piece of equipment, built of brass and steel and bakelite, with a circular display screen and a series of dials and switches that look more like something from a steampunk novel than a modern warship. The transducer, the part that actually sent out the sound pulses, is mounted on a rotating mechanism that had to be operated by hand, the operator turning a crank to sweep the beam back and forth across the ocean. It looks primitive, clumsy, absurdly simple by modern standards, and yet, this device, and others like it, won the Battle of the Atlantic. This device, operated by young men who had never seen the ocean before the war, who learned their trade in a matter of weeks, who spent hours hunched over the display in the dark, listening for the faint ping of an echo, made the difference between victory and defeat, between survival and starvation, between a world dominated by fascism and a world where democracy, however imperfect, could endure. There is no drama in this device, no cinematic glory, just a machine, built by people who understood physics, operated by people who understood their duty. And yet it changed the world, because war is not only won on the battlefield, it is won in the laboratory, in the factory, in the quiet, patient work of building better tools, better systems, better ways to see and hear and strike. The soldiers fight the war, but the scientists and engineers determine who wins. And in the Battle of the Atlantic, they determined that the U-boats would lose, that the convoys would survive, that the darkness would be pierced and the silent hunters would be hunted in turn. There is a sound that echoes through the history of the Second World War, though it is rarely heard today. It is the sound of a sonar ping, a sharp, metallic pulse transmitted into the water, bouncing off a submarine's hull, returning as an echo. Ping, echo, over and over. Relentless, patient, unyielding. It is not a loud sound. It is not particularly frightening, not in isolation, but to the men inside the submarine, it was the sound of their death approaching, the sound of the enemy closing in, the sound that told them they had been found, that invisibility had failed, that the ocean, their greatest ally, had betrayed them, and it is the sound that ended the age of the submarine as an unstoppable weapon. The sound that turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. The sound that saved Britain and perhaps the world. A simple sound. A pulse of energy transmitted and received. Nothing more than applied physics, the echo of a wave bouncing off a surface. And yet in its simplicity it contains a profound truth that knowledge is power. That the ability to see, to hear, to measure, to understand is the foundation of all dominance. That wars are not won by those who fight hardest, but by those who see clearest. The U-boat crews of 1943 learned this too late. They learned it in the darkness of the deep Atlantic, as the pings closed in, as the depth charges walked toward them, as the ocean, once their sanctuary, became their grave. They learned that silence is not enough, that invisibility is not invincible, that the darkness can be pierced, the unknown can be known, the hunter can become the hunted. They learned that someone had invented a way to see in the dark, and that invention ended their war.